We begin the day with the Israeli hostages closer to freedom than ever. Hamas has agreed to return the remaining hostages, and Israel has agreed to release a number of Palestinian detainees in return. Now, if all goes according to schedule, the last hostages will be back in Israel on Monday. News of the ceasefire deal has brought relief, but there are significant challenges ahead.
Initial joy on both sides as news breaks that agreement on the first phase of Trump's plan for Gaza has been reached. But it is the next phase that many believe will be the real test and decisive in whether the deal will hold. One of the greatest challenges looks set to be the disarmament of Hamas. Under the 20-point plan, the militants are required to decommission all weapons and destroy terrorist infrastructure, including tunnels and arms production sites. But for Hamas, this would be akin to complete surrender and leave them vulnerable if Israel decides to resume the war. It's telling, some say, that in their initial response to Trump's plan, they did not mention the issue of disarmament. Critics suggest Hamas is likely to need stronger guarantees if they are to put their weapons permanently beyond use. Another potential sticking point is the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Israel will only agree to completely pull out its forces, as Hamas demands, when it decides, along with others, including the US, that the enclave is sufficiently demilitarized and militants no longer pose a threat. A map published by the White House shows 3 phases of withdrawal. The first to coincide with the hostage release, a second as the IDF starts handing over the territory to a multinational peacekeeping force. But the third phase sees Israel staying in a buffer zone amounting to as much as 15% of the Palestinian territory, with no enforceable timeline for withdrawal. Then there's the future governance of Gaza. Initially, a technocratic, apolitical committee of Palestinians will govern the territory, supervised by what's being called the Board of Peace, headed by Trump himself and other international experts, such as the UK's Tony Blair. Hamas has to agree to have no role in the governance of the Strip. The plan does, however, envision a role in future in Gaza for the Palestinian Authority when it has, quote, reformed, i.e. become less corrupt and more efficient. But Israel's Netanyahu is vehemently opposed to this idea.
And to help us cut through the geopolitical fog and examine the profound ethical and historical implications, I'm joined by a leading voice in the field of conflict and atrocity, Professor Omer Bartov. He's a distinguished historian of Holocaust and genocide studies at Brown University. Professor, it's good to see you again. It's good to see you here in person for a change. Let me get your reaction to what has been happening right before our very eyes yesterday and today, this ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. A lasting peace?
Well, thanks for having me, and nice to see you in the studio. Well, we don't know if it's a lasting peace. It's a very early move. It's an important move because, first of all, it may end up by Monday with the release of the hostages, with the exchange of these hostages for prisoners, and with a gradual retreat of the IDF from much of Gaza. But there are many other parts of this agreement, and we just have to hope that this will lead to something much bigger. It appears to be the plan. It does appear in the later paragraphs of that plan, but whether this will actually lead to a political end and not only a military end is a big question.
Is President Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, are they just kicking the can down the road here? Because in terms of a political infrastructure for the Palestinians, that's still very nebulous.
It is very nebulous. But I have to say that although the plan is very vague and there are hardly any good faith actors here, everyone has their own interests, it is a plan that at the end of it speaks about the possibility of Palestinian statehood. And although Netanyahu on Hebrew language networks denied that it appears there. It is in writing, and he signed it. Now,
But he's not saying that to the Israeli people, is what you're saying.
He said to the Israeli people that there is no mention of a Palestinian state. But there is. And he signed it. And the question is whether he will succeed, as he has for the last 2 years, and in many ways since the beginning of his career, to sabotage that. Because his whole politics has been, for 20 years now, in fact, since 1995, has been to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state and to make sure that Israel remains in control of the entire territory of historical Palestine. But now he signed something. And the question is whether President Trump will keep focus. You know, that's hard to see happening, but...
Are you worried? Are you worried? Because President Trump, he's known for being big ideas, the art of the deal. He's not known as a man who is detail-oriented. And the devil is always in the details.
Look, I mean, I think it's true that the devil is in the details, but I also think that in an agreement like this, for it to succeed, it actually had to be vague. Part of the flexibility of that is exactly the vagueness, that different parties can understand it differently. So I'm not sure the issue is the details, the issue is whether he can keep focus on it. And he has other issues that he has to deal with, and if he loses focus, then Netanyahu may well move in to sabotage it.
But that would isolate Israel even more than it is right now, wouldn't it?
Correct. And Israel, thanks to Netanyahu's policies, is now well on the way to becoming a pariah state. Trump actually said that he was trying to save Israel from that status. But for Netanyahu, I would say that there are two elements that are most important to him. First is to stay in power, and secondly is to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And
in that order?
Yes, but I would not say that his ideological stance is secondary. I think he sees both together. And Netanyahu has been able to shelter behind people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and to say, well, they're putting pressure on me. This policy or this larger strategy is his. It always was. And he's using them in order to say, well, I'm being pushed into it. So in that sense, he has always had a particular strategy. And the question is whether what happened now, which in some ways can be described as a victory for Hamas, can be sustained as a path to changing the political paradigm, the one that he put into place and that was shattered on October 7th.
You know, when you and I first spoke on this program, it was right after the October 7th attacks. And I remember then you said you were concerned about the IDF, about the Israeli military doing things that could look like they were genocidal towards the Palestinian people in Gaza. Your opinion about that evolved over time, and we've talked about that. What do you see now? I mean, walk us through where you have changed since the events of 2 years ago.
Well, look, I mean, I was worried about what the IDF was doing in Gaza to the extent that in November of 2023, a month after the war began, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times warning that although there were already signs of war crimes and crimes against humanity, 10,000 people had died in the first few weeks of the war, most of them civilians. I warned that if this continues, it could become a genocidal campaign. And by May of 2024, I became convinced that it had, and that the official war goals of Israel, which were to destroy Hamas and release the hostages, neither of which it ever accomplished, were not the real war goals. That the war goals were reflected in the statements that were made right after October 7th, which were, they'll have no water, they'll have no food, we'll flatten Gaza, there are no uninvolved people.
Are you more convinced of the intent of genocide now than you have been before?
Yes, because there's far more evidence. Since I wrote about that in August of 24, an enormous amount of evidence has accumulated. And what Israel did after it broke the ceasefire in March of 2025, a campaign of clear starvation of the population, was only part of, showing that what the IDF was engaged in was an operation of demolition, calling it war. I mean, the war...
Well, there are still people who say, just by using the word genocide, you're giving more legitimacy to Hamas than it deserves, that you're trying to make Israel look like a perpetrator. At the same time, you're letting Hamas off the hook. I mean, Hamas is considered a terrorist group that has used civilians as shields. And if you're not accusing Hamas of genocide, it delegitimizes the efforts of Israel. We hear that time and time again.
I know. I've always found that to be a very strange argument. Even if we showed that Hamas had the intent, it didn't have the ability, but had the intent to carry out genocide in Israel, that does not give you the right to carry out genocide. Genocide is not justified. The mendacity, the evil nature of your enemy does not give you the right to become like your enemy. So for one thing, I don't see the logic of that argument. It's not to justify Hamas. It's to say that the IDF had the capacity, which Hamas did not, to destroy the Gaza Strip altogether, which it has succeeded in doing.
What about accountability? If this ceasefire plan holds, if we do have peace, do you think that there are the mechanisms that would hold the IDF, that would hold Israeli leaders accountable? Do you think those mechanisms will work at all?
Accountability is really important. If there's no accountability, if Israel is let off the hook, as it had for the last 2 years, then other states will also turn rogue. Because if Israel can do it, why should they not do it?
But what about the euphoria that could arise if we do have peace, if the Palestinians and the Israelis do begin to peacefully coexist? Do you think that euphoria will just snuff out all of the sins of the past?
I think that's what Netanyahu is hoping, clearly. I think he'll have to run for elections sooner, probably, rather than later, and we'll see in those elections. There is a possibility that if a different government is formed, and if it tries to create a different path forward, somebody will have to pay for what will obviously be discovered in Gaza, for the horrors that were there. And that new government will need somebody to be sent over to The Hague. And I hope it will be Netanyahu.
Professor Bartov, it's good to have you here in the studio. We appreciate you coming to talk with us, and we hope to see you again, and we hope that the circumstances will be more pleasant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.